It's not a brand endorsement. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for signing in. We are holding our March monthly meeting online due to public health concerns around COVID-19, practicing physical distancing here across the table. But the good news about that is that anyone can watch and listen from anywhere around the country or indeed the world. I think it's important at this time when we're not going outside as much that we keep up our social connections. I think it's going to be very good for our mental health if we can stay connected over the internet over the next few months. So thank you all for joining, especially those of you who are perhaps signing in for the first time. We're here at the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts. We've just got a skeleton crew here on audio visuals and monitoring the feeds. So that is, we are broadcasting this on YouTube Live, and after a quick chat we're going to open it up to questions and answers. So I'll just get you to check if you want to make some comments, ask some questions, that you are signed in. If you're not signed in, if you don't see the chat window, have a look in the top right of the window and you can sign in with any valid email address while we're having a chat. If you have multiple accounts, just make sure you're using the one that you want. So we don't mind reading out if we have a question from 420 YOLO, whatever, that's fine, but wouldn't be attributed to your name then. And also just keep in mind that we are recording the audio for tonight for the Science Party's forthcoming podcast. So please do get involved and ask any questions that you have. All right. So my name's Andrea Leong and I'm here with our special guest for tonight, Jonathan Symons, who is an senior lecturer in international politics at Macquarie University and the author of Ecomodernism, Technology, Politics and the Climate Crisis, which was published last year. Now, before we get into the discussion, I'm just going to frame this for the purpose of tonight's discussion. Climate change is real and it is caused by human activity, and if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then we will probably warm the planet by 3 or 4 degrees by the end of the century. And that's bad for our cities, it's bad for agriculture, it's bad for our natural environment, because all of these things are adapted to the climate that we have now, or more accurately, the climate that we had 50 years ago. So global warming, climate change is something that we would very much like to mitigate and put resources towards. So just framing that before we start. So John, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me in. And can I just say of the Science Party that at the moment when the Prime Minister was urging Australians to go to the footy, Science Party was cancelling its meetings, so good on you.
No, I'd like to be ahead of the curve. So thanks for coming in. And just to kick us off, would you mind giving us the one-sentence summary of ecomodernism, because it's quite a new term that maybe not everyone's heard of.
Someone asked this on your website and I answered that it's basically the idea that in order to, if every person around the world is to be able to live a good life on a ecologically vibrant planet, then we're going to need to collectively, and that probably means through states, invest more in the development and deployment of new technologies that are addressed at solving collective problems such as global warming. I guess I'm going a bit longer, but if there's 2 core ideas within ecomodernism, one is innovation, that the state is the only actor with the capacity and the legitimacy in order to drive the really radical transformation of the technological metabolism of society that we need. And secondly is the idea of intensification. That is to say that if we produce more food from less space, if we live in denser cities, if we use public transport, not private cars presumably, and so on, that intensification is the way that we can kind of do more on less and leave more space for nature. So, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So that that idea that we can save some space for nature by taking up a bit less space ourselves, but still have a life with all the comforts that we're used to. So something that is very present in the Australian political debate is electricity. I could probably go on and on about it. It's kind of a national embarrassment as far as I'm concerned, but that's just... Anyway, so you don't need to convince the Science Party that state-funded innovation is very important. We have a policy of increasing public research funding by doubling it. And you mentioned in your book that public research and innovation has been pretty instrumental in bringing about advances in nuclear power and hydroelectricity because of the large investment needed, and
wind and solar.
Wind and solar, yeah. So I guess fossil fuels are easy to dig out of the ground and burn, but alternative methods need a bit of development, and states, as you say, have the capacity to do that. When it comes to decarbonising the Australian electricity grid, there's a lot of appetite for wind and solar, which is great. You can see them being deployed. It's easy to see the difference they make. But it does get a little bit difficult to have more than 50%, I believe, variable renewables, because, I hate to say it, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So you either need a massively interconnected grid to connect parts of the world or the country that where the sun is shining or the wind's blowing, or you need pumped hydro, or you need a source like nuclear power, which in Australia is illegal. It's not legal to build a nuclear power plant. Do you have any comments on how we got to this point where one of our options for decarbonising the grid is not available to us?
Right. Well, if we think of the history of the environmental movement, for example, the Green Party in this country, which I was once a proud member of, that they came into existence. There are two big strands. One is the campaign against the Franklin Dam in Tasmania, and there were excellent reasons to oppose the Franklin Dam, and also the anti-nuclear movement. And of course, during the Cold War, there was, I guess, and still, resisting nuclear weapons is a entirely, sane. I hope, obviously I support that. But then there was a kind of intellectual slippage that went on where people thought that you needed to resist every part of the nuclear industry in order to resist that. And there were also serious issues, of course, that, like most of the extractive industries, that the rights of Indigenous Australians were violated. So lots of excellent reasons to resist nuclear power as well. But even today, the world's number 1 and 2 sources of low carbon electricity are hydro and nuclear power. And so the set of attitudes that were developed before climate change was a major concern, have seeped into our culture. And it means that I think we're not looking with if you're taking climate change as a crisis to which we need to respond, then you need to kind of let go of some of that ideological history and look at things with fresh eyes. And I think, so I'd be happy to engage further on why grid is hard to decarbonise without a source of firm capacity, and none of the options for firm capacity are good. I don't know whether you want to talk more about that, but I guess that's the ideological reason why I think we're in this situation. Yeah,
so we tend to mix all these things together. The nuclear disarmament, obviously a very good idea, and the way mining has sort of ridden roughshod over local communities that are affected. But Australia still mines a lot of uranium and exports it. So really neither of those two objections to nuclear power seem to be really all that relevant to why we should not have nuclear powered electricity. I don't know if there's more you want to say on the grid.
So I guess an argument has been constructed that people will make the argument wind and solar are cheaper, and they're right that if you don't care, as in if you want at midday some electricity, solar is the cheapest way to get it. But if you're going to build a stable grid, as your comments earlier suggested, you're going to need more than just wind and solar. So first 50%, and we can build a lot more wind, if we were thinking of a least cost decarbonised grid, we still need to be building more wind and solar than we have today. I'm making no argument with that.
Yeah, we're at about what now, 15%?
Oh, don't push me on that. I mean, it varies from state. South Australia
Yeah.
is one of the world, one of the highest proportions of renewable energy in the world. And then if you add in rooftop solar, it's actually hard to work out a precise percentage, but I can't give it to you. But we've decarbonised marginally in the last decade, but we're making very slow progress in our electricity grid. And of course, the grid is only, as in electricity, is only about 1/4 of global emissions, and in this country about 1/3 of emissions. But we then need something to fill in those gaps, and that thing is expensive. Some people argue that we can do it with pumped hydroelectricity, but then the first pumped hydro scheme of scale, there are lots of smaller ones around the country, but Snowy 2.0, even a lot of the green movement has resisted this. And this is the easiest, more or less, of the hydro schemes because you don't need to build any more dams. The scale of the pumped hydro that would be necessary and the resistance at local levels that you'd see, and no one's even pushing for it. In the same sense that it takes some time to develop new nuclear power, it would take years to go through the planning process, etc. So we are on track for slow reductions in the carbon intensity of the grid. We're on track for a slow transition towards renewables plus gas. But if you want to go further than that, then there's some harder thinking than the Australian community has been willing to do so far.
Yeah, low carbon is not enough. Zero carbon is not enough. We actually need negative carbon if we're going to get back to where we were when we started to realise that climate change was a problem. And electricity, depending who you ask, electricity is the biggest single contributor. Some people will say it's animal agriculture, but just one last thing on electricity is that is set to become a bigger contributor to emissions, because we do need to think about electrifying our transport, because we can have clean electricity at some stage, but we can never have a clean petrol car, and same with gas heating and cooking. So that's another maybe 50% from what I've read for our electricity demand once we do that. But now, if you don't mind, I'd also like to talk about the second point, animal agriculture and the emissions that come from there. I think one of the problems that I shouldn't characterise it as a problem per se. One of the reasons it's such a big part of our greenhouse gas footprint is that people like to eat meat, and it's always been a big part of the human diet. So forcing people to change is not really going to be an easy thing to do, and wouldn't necessarily want to do it through force. So have you got comments on the animal agriculture industry? And
so first, I've been a vegetarian, nearly a vegan all my adult life, and just for animal liberation reasons, I would certainly...
Yeah, high fives for nearly veganism.
Nearly veganism. I would make arguments on that basis to anyone who would listen, but I don't believe in coercion, and other people choose meat. And one of the most promising paths to end animal agriculture is the development of synthetic milk and meat. In this country, I think 56% of the national landmass is devoted to livestock industries. If you add, I can't give you a precise number for dairy around the world, but if you think of the amount of land that is cleared to produce crops such as soy that are fed to livestock, the amount of land that is devoted to grazing livestock, and the same, and dairy is part of that, this is both, we have methane emissions, and in the short term, in the next decade, most years methane is Australia's #1 source of warming. It's less of a long-term problem because methane only remains in the atmosphere for a decade. But so methane from animal agriculture is a huge problem. We already have in, of course, San Francisco, the commercialisation of synthetic milk. This is milk brewed using yeast. So there is no animal involved in the production. Well, there was probably a stem cell once, but there's no animal involved in the production of it. That takes out the cruelty, it takes out the methane emissions, and it takes out, produces the fraction of the footprint. So you can spare a lot of land potentially for rewilding through this. If you look at so there's going to be a fight over this technology because the yeast is genetically engineered. So I assume a party such as the Science Party would have, they'd embrace the environmental benefits. If you were to look at some other environmental parties in this country's policies, they would say that this should be unlawful. In the near term, we can see the dairy industry, synthetic milk coming. If we go slightly into the longer term, the same thing's going to happen to mincemeat first, leather fairly soon, and steak and things like that are going to be harder to replace. But we can see the potential to replace most of animal agriculture with a set of technologies that many people currently demonise.
Yeah, just to clarify for our viewers and listeners, the Science Party is explicitly pro genetic modification research and getting those technologies into the market where they have been assessed by the appropriate technologies, so the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, which is what happens at the moment for any gene technology. And there is genetically modified crops out there. Animals, it's a little less common, but one of the other methods of reducing cruelty is I believe it's a CSIRO development where male chick embryos can be looked at with under a black light or some kind of light to see which one is a male, so it can be not incubated rather than left to hatch, and then you see it's a male and then throw it in the grinder. So it seems that GM technologies, gene modification technologies, do knock two things on the head at once: the animal liberation issues as well as the carbon intensity issues.
I'd look forward to the moment which is, I think also, so we're not going to have eggs that are produced, but we're going to have egg whites and egg proteins which are produced with the same kind of precision fermenting technologies that I was speaking about for milk. They're only, they're being commercialised as we speak, so they're a near-term possibility as well. Not terribly big climate implications, so I tend not to talk about them so much, but animal rights people, that gets rid of another, massively cruel industry.
What a time to be alive. So these are, I think, nuclear power and genetic modification are two areas where ecomodernists and traditional, you might call dark green environmentalists tend to clash. And in your book you talk about the hubris of it. Traditional environmentalism has come from a place of sort of maybe being more in harmony with nature, as opposed to the eco-modernist philosophy of leaving space for nature by removing our harmful effects on it, intensification. I'd like to talk about some of the more broad issues and maybe tension between the two strands of environmentalism when we talk about decarbonising, reducing greenhouse gases more globally. So we can talk about nuclear power and GM foods here in our bubble, which is very wealthy by global standards. But there are a lot of people who don't have access to the same easy energy that we do. So how does ecomodernism tackle giving people access to modernity while we're also trying to tackle the climate crisis?
So it's an incredibly difficult question. Takes me, as part of the process of thinking through this book, I went to the Breakthrough Dialogues, which the Breakthrough Institute, which is the kind of the think tank in the States most associated with this set of ideas, hosts. And Samir Saran, who's an Indian economist, brought down the house at one of those by saying, our poverty must not be your mitigation strategy. And there are some really, really tough questions here because the World Bank no longer funds fossil fuel projects in the developing world. And at a time, in the next couple of months, Germany's going to open a new coal-fired power station, Datteln 4. At a time when, and we get, the world gets just under 80% of its energy from fossil fuels. That's the mix that the rich world has. And so at the time when the rich world is still run by fossil fuels, we are saying to the developing world, no, you could call, well, as an Indian economic advisor coined the term carbon conditionality to describe this, that we are imposing an energy model on the developing world that we would not accept for ourselves. Now, if these are really tough choices, then I think, and I think this would be the standard ecomodernist argument, that these choices belong to in each country, each political community, to make for itself. What I would say that allies in the rich world should be doing is developing the technologies so that there are no invidious choices. Like right now, people say wind and solar are cheaper. The developing world doesn't need, doesn't need baseload power, etc. That's not true. The path to living, to human development includes the energy demands that nowhere in the world satisfies without, the only decarbonised grids are run on hydro or nuclear. No one's done it without just on the wind and solar model. And so there's a bunch of other areas. The same with gene modification. If a community chooses to reject that, go for it. But the European Union has used its power to basically impose bans on GM food on its major trading partners in the developing world. So I guess pluralism is the short answer, and allies of we need to also to democratise the process of technology development. If we only develop cures for male pattern baldness and no one bothers to invest in malaria cures, well, innovation hasn't served the global interest there. So there are social dimensions to this as well. We need to democratise innovation. We need to make innovation serve the interests of people everywhere. I guess that would be an eco-modernist response.
There's a point you made there about the industrialised or developed rich world imposing standards on other countries that it wouldn't accept for itself, and that brings to mind the argument that is made by people who don't think Australia needs to reduce its emissions by saying, oh, well, look at China and India, they emit so much greenhouse gases when Australia only emits about 1.3% of the world's total. So even ignoring the fact that we export a lot of fossil fuels, Australia has for a while been among the top few per capita emitters. Do you find that a convincing argument to bring down our per capita reductions rather than our total reductions?
Hang on. We need to, I just used the phrase net zero. As a rich country, we have an obligation to reach net zero. Everywhere needs to reach net zero. So I guess that's our goal. So the idea that because we're a small percentage, no.
Yeah, I think the argument I like to use is if you look at China, you can say, yes, well, they emit much more on a total basis, but then if you were to that's just a geopolitical division, China as a country. If you were to split China up into its provinces, then they each emit maybe about the same as Australia, and then you could make the same argument for them. So it's no longer valid. We need to decarbonise.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's it. And go on.
No, well, any way that you make that, I'm only a small part, then you're undermining the potential for cooperation.
Yeah, and given the resources that we have, I think it is just more or less a moral obligation to do the research that it takes to develop these technologies to make it economically feasible to...
Not only economically, but also politically feasible. A party couldn't win power promising to end meat, promising to end, I was about to say to end aviation. Today we ended aviation, so perhaps it wasn't the best example, but it's not a promise that you'd be likely to win office with. So in the long term, we need synthetic zero carbon jet fuels because it's very unlikely that people are going to accept an end to, and when I say focusing on aviation, that's a rich person's source of emissions. It's just one example. Yep. Around the world, they're all, the average person doesn't have access to a washing machine. Is an example that I use in the book to think that of the material sacrifices that you would be asking to reach zero emissions with exactly today's technologies. It's just politically non-viable.
Yep. So these are some tensions, I suppose. We've talked about tensions between traditional environmentalism and ecomodernism, and perhaps the more politically viable strategy, and the one that's best for human flourishing, is to put forward the alternatives that like alternative modes of energy generation and ways of producing the foods that people like to eat. Do you see any areas of overlap between the green movement and eco-modernism where we can maybe work together and be stronger in our approach to?
Absolutely. In fact, to people who are not deep in environmentalism, I sound like Naomi Klein, I sound like Adam Band, etc. It's kind of a narcissism of small differences. And I also observe, because I teach environmental politics at Macquarie University, that the students who take my global environmental politics unit don't share all of the same kind of, I'd call it ideological baggage that my generation and above shares. So they're committed to many of the same things, to Indigenous rights, to to ecological, sort of biodiversity, etc. They're committed to many of the same things that older generations are. But when you talk about resistance to using genetic modification to improve human welfare, and some there are examples such as half of Indian women are iron deficient. Were you to produce, and we can do, but we're not commercialising, a chickpea, which is more the nutrients are more bioavailable, you could solve that without any dietary change. Whereas at the moment there's a big kind of push towards eating more animal products because you needed to solve that problem. So basically, younger generations don't share that baggage. So actually I suspect that maybe in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, the gaps between the Science Party and the Greens might be smaller than it is, because as new generations come forward. But, we just spoke about synthetic milk a minute ago. I suspect if you spoke to your average 25-year-old Green Party member, and in fact the Animal Justice Party in New South Wales is completely committed to that transition to synthetic milk and meat. So on most things, eco-modernists and Greens see eye to eye. In fact, one of the nice things about I shouldn't say one of the nice things, the coronavirus is obviously a tragedy, which is, I shouldn't, but one of the interesting things is that people who would normally be my enemy on Twitter or in other forums, we're now having conversations because I guess the same commitment to delivering public goods is shared by the two, and here there are no ideological hang-ups that are dividing us. Yeah,
it's certainly revealing a lot of interesting things about where we're coming from when we're solving problems, a global pandemic like this. I've noticed with the school climate strikes, also a commitment to state funding of more renewables, even though there is still the opposition to nuclear. That's come into their set of demands. They are very committed to the idea of having state-funded renewables projects. I guess that comes back to the idea of it being the state being the maybe the only body that's large enough, but also, as you say, has the legitimacy to fund these sorts of.
That's actually you just made a penny drop into place for me, because another one of the older Green movement's commitments was to resisting the state. The state was a kind of institution of domination which buttressed patriarchy, buttressed class inequality, etc. And it can do all of those things. But so resisting the state, celebrating only small technologies, is one of the other differences. So you're entirely right that the idea of the Green New Deal is one that actually some of the founders of the Breakthrough Institute were arguing for a Green New Deal a decade ago, but it's an idea which is quite different from what the Green movement was talking about 20 years ago. And I just wanted to say Greta Thunberg is more nuanced than opposing nuclear power. She doesn't like it, but she recognises that it's a source of zero carbon energy. So she's made some balanced statements there.
Yeah, I mean, that's good to hear. It's an option that the Science Party believes should be on the table. We made a submission to the inquiry into nuclear power, and we're pretty pleased to see the recommendation that we should be looking into making legal newer forms of generation, not the decades-old technology that we have, but some of the safer technologies with less waste, and putting more into nuclear fusion, which is something I'm looking forward to, but obviously we can't hang our hat on it and say it's all going to be fine, we're going to have fusion any day now. We might, it depends how much money we put into it. But yeah, as we've said, even if we have the breakthrough tomorrow and we solve energy, there are still going to be divisions, but also ways that we can work together between these different streams of environmentalism. One question that always comes up when we talk about using or having less of an impact on the world is population. And I think you might have a few things to say about that. There's a lot of, there's always a comment in any internet discussion, definitely, about how we should all just, cull the population. Okay. Not cull,
yeah, well,
reduce the population substantially.
Yeah, well, I guess again, obviously it is true. If there were fewer people, we would have a lower impact. But I don't see a path to fewer people, other than obviously also empowering women, greater gender equality, access, control over reproductive freedoms, etc. These things are all, pathways to, and also as we get richer, as people in the developing world, in the global south become richer, they people tend to have smaller family sizes. So we're actually, the thing that, until maybe this week, until very recently, the thing that has been increasing global population most is people living longer. And that's the kind of trend that no one is going to say no, as you know, but we celebrate that. I just don't see a acceptable way of putting downward pressure on population. And in fact, one of the arguments that I make in the book, I don't know whether this is as popular as it was, but when I was at university, my lecturers were always telling me about the forms of conditionality that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had imposed on the developing world, and everything they said was correct. But there was one form of conditionality that I only learnt about a few years ago, which was that following books like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, in the 1970s, countries such as Sweden and the United States made their food aid conditional upon developing countries reaching sterilisation targets. So literally tens of millions of people in the global south, countries like India were particularly badly hit, were involuntarily sterilised. And any kind of logic which views population as a path to addressing environmental problems winds up or has the risk of winding up at that kind of idea. So I guess it offends my values.
It's not exactly compatible with human rights to be trying to make our lives better by taking away all of our human freedoms that we take to be self-evident. So I think that probably covers some of the major topics that I wanted to cover, but we'll go to some questions now, I think. What have we got here? All right, here's one coming through online. So this relates to the COVID-19 coronavirus situation that we find ourselves in. It's becoming apparent that we, and I suppose that's Australia, but countries around the world are quite happy to take up a war footing against an existential threat. Perhaps we're doing this for COVID-19 because the effects are so obvious, but we're not treating the climate crisis with such urgency. What are your comments on that and the lack of action, even though we've got the political will to do it depending on the crisis?
Yeah, I guess first I agree with Alan Jones. The coronavirus is the climate change of health. And I think your question, I think Alan Jones meant it in the opposite way.
I was going to say, is that...
Well, no,
that means it's a problem?
Yeah, exactly. He thinks they're both hoaxes. I think he's right, that there's actually quite a strong parallel between the two. And I guess it's that, we're probably most of us are worried about family members. If we're under 60, say, then the personal risk of death is very low, but the risk of a serious illness, maybe needing intensive care for any of us in the next 6 months, is quite real. But also the possibility that family members who are a little older, I won't go into it, but you live away from your family, and there's an outside chance you're not going to see people again. So that focuses the mind in a way that the awareness of the inevitable loss of the Great Barrier Reef, or as that's less personal, it's less immediate. So it does make sense. But I also think some of the fights we have about climate change we would not have around coronavirus. So many people say we have the technologies we need. Talking about innovation is a distraction from taking action. Actually, no, we can do both, and we need to do both. Today we have the technologies we need to stop the coronavirus. That's been demonstrated not just by Wuhan but also by South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. However, it's very, very difficult. It involves such social isolation that we as social animals would find that intolerable on a long-term basis. So yeah, we have the technologies we need to stop coronavirus, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be exploring the possibility of a vaccine. So I'd say, the same thing applies in climate change. We need to do the things we can do now, and also make it possible to have the science and technology for a better future. Same, I think, applies with coronavirus. So. Yeah.
And also in this case, we've had government ministers stand shoulder to shoulder with medical experts, giving press conferences, and we saw maybe a little bit of that creeping in with the bushfires as well. Do you think this might signal a bit of a return, or depending on where we were before, a return to taking experts seriously?
I'm not sure I can promise that. I mean, it's actually too hard right now to know. The world after this is going to be different. The infrastructure of global healthcare that we have today was a response to as in the emergence of World Health Organization, its predecessor organizations, etc., was a response to 19th century pandemics. I suspect maybe there will be a turn to expertise, but there's also going to be some other more surveillance, hopefully a stronger social security system, and I would assume definitely deeper investments in public health.
Yeah, we would hope so. I think it's probably time to say it's time for an Australian Centres for Disease Control. It's something that just about every rich nation has, and we've seen what definitely appears to be a lack of coordination nationally to our response. Also on the topic of listening to experts, we do have a weird division in Australian science, where some science is politicised and some is not. So, we're obviously happy to listen to medical experts. Australia has always had that a strong basis in medical research, and quantum computing gets a lot of political support straight from the top, and so it should. But again, climate science is...
And agriculture.
Yeah, we've got...
We're leaders in innovation in all kinds of areas,
So when it comes to energy, I mean, I'm just going to have to say it's to do with fossil fuel interests. I can't see much more of a basis for some of the anti-decarbonisation sentiment that we have.
I'd say yes to that. I just wanted to add on the expertise and corona question. Depends on also which experts you're listening to, because I think our government has been prioritising the economy over health, and maybe that is changing now. So it may be that the experts that they listen to, and the idea of flattening the curve versus killing the virus, I think we're seeing transition, and because there is debate among epidemiologists as to what the appropriate strategy is, and I think to date we've put the economy before health. I hope that changes.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the changes that we make to income support as well, because if you forcibly shut down anything, then you're sort of obliged to give people in those industries the income support that they've lost. So entertainment and tourism are obviously getting hit very hard by this. And while we have social distancing that is still not mandatory, I guess we can say, oh well, that's their problem. But if we were to lock things down forcibly, then that would be that would give more ammunition to a call for subsidising people's lost income. But then we're getting into more authoritarian sort of things, and we need to start talking about a Bill of Rights. So it's all very complex.
Another thing that's very clear now is if you're a casual worker and you've got some cold symptoms and you get no sick pay, the financial pressures mean that you have to go to work, and that is a risk to everyone. So the argument for a stronger social welfare system, I think, might become apparent to more people at this time.
Yeah, it might make it obvious that it benefits us all. Coming back again to energy technology, do you think Australia is particularly well placed to make innovations in technology if we would fund and push the research?
Well, we have a highly skilled workforce. We have a lot of people with scientific training who are not fully utilising their skills. So I guess it's not that we are uniquely well placed, and there are some areas where agricultural research is one of them, where we are genuine world leaders. So yeah, we're well placed, and we're probably slipping backwards, but we have the capacity to do much more.
We have a question here from online. The Science Party often takes ambitious and controversial stances, nuclear being one of them, but there are others. Sometimes that results in a person who is 90% on board with the platform getting upset with just one part of a policy. What do you think about intellectual and ideological purism, and how do we tackle that?
Should I ask you that question?
Well, you first.
Okay. Well, I guess that's especially, it's part of political life. And, there's no political party who completely represents anyone's values. So I guess part of the job of politics is assembling coalitions and also identifying issues which connect to people emotionally, which assemble coalitions that are, sufficiently significant in order to win support. So there's no solving that, and there's probably, we're all guilty of it on our pet issues. I find it challenging to vote for the Labor Party, which I sometimes do, when they are a party which supports policies that mandatorily detain refugees, and that's a very tough issue. For people who support the Labor Party, that's a very the kind of Machiavellianism that would be necessary to say, yeah, I'll vote for the party that just has less bad kind of concentration camp philosophies than the other mob. But a lot of people work through that. I'm not sure whether I have a clear answer here, except that's always part of politics. It's your job to try and manage that.
Yeah, I'm learning that politics is the art of finding what's true and correct, but also where that overlaps with what people care about, because that's what people are going to base their decisions on at the ballot box. And I think we're quite lucky in this country to have preferential voting, so you can rank your choices obviously in order of what you want. So if you like 90% of what a party is about, I guess it depends on whether the 10% is an absolute deal breaker, or whether you say, well, that's the closest to my ideals, so I'm going to vote for that party. I might even join them, might sign up on the website, and then go from there. Well, this party's 80% of what I like, this party's terrible, I'll put them last. So not many countries seem to have preferential voting. So
no, you're right, we're very lucky in that, yeah.
I've got a question here from Josh Field. To what degree do you believe that reducing distance for food, the distance that food travels from farm to plate, especially in export and import, I suppose, impacts the greenhouse gas emissions of the industry? Are food miles much of an impact?
It would depend on the product. If you're eating the most carbon intensive foods, there'll be or methane intensive foods often, there will be a tiny fraction. especially things. I mean, if you fly fresh flowers across the world, then the emissions from transport are very significant. If you eat some rice which has been shipped from Thailand or somewhere, then it's the methane from the growing of the rice, which is the vast bulk of rather than the shipping. So it's different from product to product. I think we've got to, the idea of reducing emissions, I think, is the problem. We've got to talk about zero emissions. And if we talk about zero emissions, then the transport has to end up being zero, and the production needs to end up being zero, or we also need negative emissions. This is actually, I'm really pleased you raised this earlier, because it's not on the public mind at the moment, that all of the models in which we avoid dangerous warming involve vast amounts of negative emissions in the coming century. Planting forests is not enough. We need something bigger than that. I'm off topic here, but yeah.
Oh, no.
When we get to negative emissions, so when we basically the goal of zero emissions, I think is more important than worrying about food miles, given just how complex that is. I'm not saying, I'm not completely against thinking about food miles, but I think it's been, localism is one of the areas where perhaps ecomodernists differ from most Greens. So I guess the food miles discourse, I think, is probably motivated by some commitments to localism, rather than it being a particularly good way of tackling reaching zero emissions.
Right, so we've got to look at both of those as separate issues and look at them on their merits, I guess. Getting to zero emissions, something I meant to ask earlier on, so this is now me asking the question, that's the host's prerogative, I guess, was I wanted to talk about carbon pricing and emissions trading schemes. And you talk a lot in the book about the inadequacy of the price and the maybe it's not so useful to have domestic carbon prices that aren't linked to a global market. It's sort of a complex topic, so I don't know if there's a simple or top-level rundown that you could give us.
So carbon pricing is an important mechanism, and economists love it. It's an economically efficient way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In order to either have carbon pricing that reflects the social cost of carbon, or carbon pricing at a level which would drive us to zero emissions, you need carbon which is priced at hundreds of dollars a tonne. We had a carbon price that was a tiny fraction of that. And we in Australia remember the political response to that. Around the world, most carbon pricing is at around $10 a tonne. I might have that slightly wrong, but it's at most a fifth, more like a tenth, or of what would be required for that to be the mechanism. So I'm in favour of carbon pricing. Back when we were debating here, I'd write op-eds, etc., advocating the carbon pricing. But perhaps there will be progress towards a global price which brings additional benefits beyond a national carbon price. I'm in favour of both. But I think they're politically fragile, and you can do them at the same time as you invest in innovation and, in my book, the Green New Deal kind of approaches, state deployment of a zero emissions grid, for example. I don't know whether you think much about neoliberalism in the Science Party, but carbon pricing is part of, I guess, an economically liberal toolkit. Politically, it's failed to tackle the problem. So I'm not saying I'm still in favour of it, but we've got to do more than that because it's not politically sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem that we've arrived at over decades, and there's no real reason to think it should be an easy problem to get out of. It seems like we should be tackling it from all sorts of angles, and it's going to be expensive because we've spent so long burning fossil fuels. Question from James. What do you think is easier, converting existing Greens members to an eco-modernist position, not necessarily getting them to change their explicit political party affiliation, but bringing them onto an eco-modernism kind of approach, or activating a previously unactivated population that's just looking for that third way.
The latter. Just to add a little bit, as in, so amongst environmentalists, ecomodernism is about as popular as Donald Trump. They think that the arguments, I'm not 100% in agreement with the ecomodernists, but broadly I'm sympathetic to their position. They think the arguments that people like me make, many environmentalists, are monstrous. When I sent, there's a manifesto there's an ecomodernist manifesto that I sent to a prominent economist associated with the Labor Party, and we had a little discussion, and he said, this is so self-evident as to be boring. He's not someone who spends his time thinking about climate change, but he regards it as a major pressing challenge. When I talk to normal people, as in my friends working in sectors outside environmentalism, they've only got a patience for a minute or two of my ramblings. But
I know the feeling.
But there's not much that's controversial here. But the problem is, for most people, this is not their first priority when they're voting. Obama ran on what was basically an eco-modernist platform, he didn't bring the traditional technological hang-ups. As a candidate, he said, so in the United States, nuclear supplies about 20% of electricity and more than half of low-carbon energy. Obama recognised that, said that nuclear, and also another reason for the US to support development of nuclear is to export new small modular reactors or whatever to the rest of the world, or basically for that technology to be available elsewhere. There's a reason why powers like China, United States, etc. might develop it. So Obama, it's not going to be central to what wins government, because we care more about our schools and our healthcare, etc. than we do, as voters generally care more about this. But it fits very well into probably a slightly left of centre, social democratic kind of a platform. And there are plenty of times when you can see leaders like Obama who have successfully built electoral politics around it.
Yeah, so perhaps the label ecomodernism is something to be deployed very selectively, and we can just talk about the ideas embodied within it, and talk about those when we're talking about political choices, because as you say, it is schools and hospitals, the things that we interact with on a daily basis that make people's minds up at the ballot box. We know from surveys that Australians are concerned about climate change, but it's just not like a daily pressure for us.
Yeah, the challenge here is that the kind of narrative that I distinguish between Naomi Klein's narrative and Greta Thunberg's narrative, but the narrative that we have the technologies that we need, that all that is stopping us is political will, that if we eliminate emissions, most people will be better off. That narrative is, and the kind of the idea that extractivism and resistance towards it is kind of the new class divide, the new the new central division in politics. That's a powerful narrative that has a lot of people mobilised behind it, and many of those people say, they say it's more important to overthrow. There's no point addressing climate change if you don't also overthrow capitalism, and it's not that I'm even against overthrowing capitalism. It's just that they're distinct problems. Another thing that I talk about a bit is solar geoengineering. You could do that either on a global scale, and I won't talk about that now, but in Australia there have been recently some feasibility studies into small-scale interventions that would cool the Great Barrier Reef during bleaching incidents. And some people will say, if you use these technological interventions to save the Great Barrier Reef, but you haven't challenged the underlying structures, there's no point doing it. And I guess I'm an old-fashioned greenie who wants to keep the ecosystems that we have. And if the only way to do that is with intervention, with the Great Barrier Reef, in fact, it is probably because we've baked in the next 10 years of warming, definitely.
But it is that. Those sort of ideas that make you think, But if we do that, then we will never stop burning coal. But it's, I do think political, people's engagement on climate change as a political issue is moving forward. So even if it is just buying us some time, there's no reason why we shouldn't throw that piece of technology at the problem.
Yeah, I'd have a long conversation about that. In the case of global solar geoengineering, I'd say the decision belongs with the developing world. Rich people have imposed this problem on the developing world.
Yes, it's different if you're throwing sulphur up into the atmosphere. That's a different question.
It's a difficult set of choices, but so it's not like I advocate strongly for it, but what I do advocate is, one of the ideas that the Green Movement holds tight to is that we should not interfere in complex systems, that efforts to make the world better, efforts to improve our biophysical environment are likely to lead to unintended consequences. Now, that idea is the exact parallel of what conservatives make about social change. That idea is the same idea that Tony Abbott threw at marriage equality. That sure, it would be great his sister could get married and people could, celebrate their love, but
we all have to make sacrifices.
Yeah, and that change would interfere in a complex system and it would have dangerous unintended consequences. Now, sometimes there are dangerous unintended consequences, but I don't think there's a rule of thumb that says you should never intervene. I think we're now at a point of danger with climate change and other problems where we need to basically take things on the science rather than from some ideological set of principles.
I think that's where we are at now with GM foods, saying that there could be problems, maybe not so much foods, but the genetically engineered mosquitoes that were released to try and fight Zika transmission. So there is a cost to doing nothing in that case, and there's a cost to doing nothing when it comes to climate change as well. Do you think we'll see political leaders who are able to cut through with that message and have an ambitious platform to make some big changes, the big changes that we need, like the platform that Obama ran on?
Hopefully I'm sitting across the table from one. I think it's a really tricky challenge to try and weave a commitment to global problems into narratives that also connect to people without creating false villains, if that makes sense. It's much easier to point to some enemy or to, so... They're
taking our jobs.
Exactly. Whether it's the refugees or the, I don't know, so it's a very patient and smart politics that achieves that. I guess right now we are at the start of an event which is of a scale like a world war. And after the world wars, we have, after World War I, World War II, we've built new institutions. We've been willing to rethink things, redesign the world in ways that we are not normally. So it's not that I'm particularly hopeful for what's going to come next, but this is a turning point moment in which I think in a way anything is possible. A really dystopian future or some big shifts.
Which timeline are we in? The idea of a just transition is another one that's becoming a staple of the schools climate movement and the citizens climate movement. So I think that will have some cut through to say that we have to bring workers along with this. Fossil fuels have been such a big part of our economy and state backed for so long. It is entirely unfair to pull that rug out from under workers. I'm not big on the idea that we should say, just learn computer coding. It's if someone's industry is ending, I would support those people being able to retrain in whatever the hell they wanted.
Yeah. For me, the biggest political challenge there is the global just transition. And we see this with coronavirus, that we need effective healthcare systems everywhere. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc., have solved, as in they've ended the virus domestically, but they're vulnerable to everywhere else. So basically, there are all kinds of issues. Climate change is, has global impacts. Where that just transition needs to obviously we need a domestic just transition, and the politics of that is harder. But the politics of the global just transition is something we don't think enough about. And political leaders, it's an even harder sell.
Yes, bringing everyone along is the perpetual challenge. We've got a question from, maybe it's Uecon, maybe it's double Oecon, Icon. As a policy, emissions trading can seem pretty counterintuitive compared to something like mining leases. Might have to ask for clarification on this one. But fundamentally, they both charge for using the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is a big concept when we talk about environmental damage. What can make it seem like a more reasonable policy?
What can make emissions trading seem more reasonable,
or
anything which right?
Emissions trading, I believe, is the question.
Yeah.
Because maybe this is, you know, how you've got the narrative. Oh, we're going to pay a new tax and it's going to fix the weather.
Yeah.
How do you counter that?
That's a very tough question.
It's not straightforward.
I mean, in different parts of the world, it's had a different political response. And it's just so easy to demonise. The Axe the Tax campaign in this country. So even in the United Kingdom, there's a bipartisan support for for protecting the commons, I guess. One thing I worry about with the commons metaphor is, in a sense, the commons is already depleted. If we go back to Garrett Hardin, who's a terrible character, but I won't go into that, metaphor of the tragedy of the commons. He suggested that in a traditional village that the common land would be destroyed once people became rich enough for everyone to graze cows on the land. But we're at the point now where the commons is already, there's no grass, it's just a dust bowl. There's no food coming from the common, as in, we're past that point with climate change, which is, I guess why I argue for emissions trading or carbon pricing or whatever it is, argue for things that price the commons, but I actually think we now need to do more than that. Those market instruments.
Mm-hmm. Necessary but not sufficient?
And they we've been tinkering with them, trying them. They haven't been sufficiently politically effective for decades. So I support them, but I think we need more.
All right, well, we are just about coming up to the end of our hour, so was there any final comments that you wanted to add about ecomodernism and its prospects? Or
oh, that's a big open question, isn't it? I guess in a way, so I'm not confident that the label ecomodernism will be, there won't be an ecomodernist party that wins power and whatever, but I do think that the ideas are slowly winning the debate. So I guess you made this point earlier, that many of the sub-arguments that have been brought together by ecomodernists, we can make those arguments, and probably, you said, someone asked it before, what's the way to progress? By winning over Greens or by building a new coalition? In general, the answer is building a new coalition, but there are some issues, and even, the synthetic milk is one, and synthetic meat is one. Sure, green policy today says no, that is not allowable, but as that becomes real, and as you make the arguments to, I don't know how old the average Green Party member is, but to younger Greens, I can't see how they could resist something that addresses animal cruelty, addresses methane emissions, addresses land use, makes milk protein cheaper. There's just no downside to it. So I can't imagine how some of these individual arguments are not going to win.
All right. Well, I think having read the book, it doesn't offer a rosy-eyed view that everything is going to be fine, but it also isn't all doom and gloom either. It's the message seems to be that there's a lot of work to do across political and technological and social fields, but if we do that, then there is some hope for the future. So ultimately, it's maybe neither optimistic nor pessimistic.
I guess that's probably right.
So we still have time for a good Anthropocene, is the way of.
Yeah, and we sometimes, in fact, the book begins reflecting on the HIV crisis and the way in which Ronald Reagan said, teach abstinence as virtue. and the way in which humanity responded, advocating for science, advocating for democratization of drug research, of the changes in global intellectual property rules that were made in order to give antivirals to the global south. And so crises like climate change, like coronavirus, like HIV, often we rally around them and wind up doing something better. So there's a big political fight ahead, and good on you.
Yeah, so whether it's something in the long term like climate change, although it's a pressing problem now, or whether it's the current COVID-19 crisis, we are all in this together. So be good to each other, keep your social distancing where you can, physical distancing, so that those who have to do essential jobs can keep doing that. We are all in this together. Thank you very much, John. We've got a little gift for you here.
Oh wow, you shouldn't have.
Oh, you might not say that when you see what it is.
Thank you so much. Am I supposed to look?
Have a look.
Oh my God! Oh, it's essentials. I'm actually regretting it. I should have done more stockpiling, and this is one of the things I needed. This I've got 7 rolls left, so this is handy.
Well, can I use it? All right, thank you. I won't shake your hand, of course, but
we can touch feet.
We can touch feet. All right.
Or the Taiwanese.
Thank you very much for coming in, and we will be doing our meetings as live broadcasts for the foreseeable future. So thank you again. Bye.
Thanks so much.